Hi, I'm Mary Jessome, a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of British Columbia and research manager for CEDAR, and this is...
Hi, I'm Tom Einhorn. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also a member of the CEDAR team.
We try and take community-informed approaches to survey making for the presentation that we just did. And in doing so, we're pretty excited to, of course, measure normal things that we think about with trust, like the history of mistrust amongst racialized communities and Indigenous communities, but also some of the positive or beneficial factors like cultural practices or cultural identity that racialized community members can use or rely on when making a decision to get vaccinated. So what Tom talked about was, for example, Indigenous people who bleed more are more likely to get vaccinated than those who don't. And I think what we're hoping people take away is that when we include racialized or Indigenous communities in the research process, we're more likely to uncover things that matter to them and that will also influence their health outcomes. And as researchers or health practitioners, we can do a better job thinking about those things and designing interventions or studies that actually meet people's needs in community rather than the assumptions that we usually make in colonial institutions.
Yeah, so just like Mary said, we hope that people include more measures when we try to look at vaccine uptake or people's decision to get vaccinated. It's important to look at more measures than just how they self-identify, but also how they experience their identity, specifically their racialized identity, and also how they interact with cultural practices, and and group identities.
Do you have any specific examples?
Yes, just like you said. I mean, we've seen that people who um, engage in specific cultural practices, specifically beading or telling Indigenous histories or participating in specific arts and crafts, traditional arts and crafts, are more likely to be vaccinated this really uncovers the protective function of these practices. And we've also seen that people who are more likely to be identified as Indigenous by strangers are less likely to be vaccinated. And this speaks to the potential of discrimination or harm that might come to people who are perceived as Indigenous in healthcare settings and also in other settings. So it's not only how people self-identify, it's also how others perceive them and the potential that this might have for harm that also impacts people's decisions to get vaccinated.
Maybe to repeat what we said, including community makes more informed, culturally informed decisions and socially informed decisions for research or health providers. So get community involved and also don't assume that you know everything about what motivates people to stay healthy. There's lots of other factors that we often don't think about that will drive people to engage in positive health behaviors. And what something that came up in the presentation is people are wondering, how do we form trust with Indigenous communities? And that was a really important discussion. It's something that lots of people struggle to understand how to do. And I think one of the key takeaways from that time that I hope people think about is just showing up without expectations and continuing to be available and be in good relationship with Indigenous people. And when Indigenous people need help or they have a question, they will come to you as a trustworthy person, because Indigenous communities and other racialized communities know what they need and they know what they have or don't have. And so they're happy to seek out help with people who are around and that have done the work to be trustworthy in the long term. But it's a slow process.
Yes, and I think that's very important. But I think also in terms of research to design, we often design research to compare communities either to one another or often to compare racialized communities to non-racialized communities. And this type of research is very valuable, of course, but there's also value and benefit in just studying communities themselves without the need to compare them to other communities. And when you do that, we find a lot of surprising findings and a lot of we are able to understand communities better when we don't necessarily need to compare them to other communities. So I think that's also an important takeaway.